Welcome to the Popcorn Talk Network. For the online broadcast network that features movie discussion, news, and interviews, press 1.
Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
From the Popcorn Talk Network, the online broadcast network for movie talk, this is Historic Hollywood, spotlighting the most influential and founding members of Hollywood.
Welcome, Internet, to another edition of Historic Hollywood, a celebration of the cinema of yesteryear and the people who made it. You can follow us on YouTube, Twitter, all of the things. Find our stream at youtube.com/Popcorn Talk Network. You can follow the network at Popcorn Talk. I am Lex Michael, Twitter handle at the Lex Michael, and with me are
Byron Thompson. My Twitter handle is at Byron Lee.
Karie Bible. My Twitter handle is at filmradar.
And today, we are talking about legendary and wildly influential horror producer Val Lewton. So before we dive into the meat and potatoes portion of this conversation, I wanted to ask you guys first and foremost, how did you discover Val Lewton?
I'll let you go first, Karie.
I think, like a lot of people, Cat People is the kind of the seminal Val Lewton movie that tends to draw everybody in.
Sure, but how did you did you stumble upon it on TV one day, or?
I think I saw it in film school, actually, because that was a time when I was just watching, 12, 15 movies a week and just filling my mind with everything I can get my hands on.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I think it was 1982. Paul Schrader's version of Cat People came out, and I wasn't really old enough to see it, but got a chance to get in there and see it as well, and then that basically opened it up to reading a lot of Histories of Famous Monsters and finding out there was another Cat People.
Right.
And that's kind of how I found out about Val Lewton, not thinking of him in the same creative sense as a lot of the directors, but clearly just as influential, as you said.
Absolutely, and we're going to dig into that quite a bit as we get further into the conversation. For me, it was also Cat People. It was also the remake of Cat People, and going even further removed, it was the David Bowie song Cat People that was written for Paul Schrader's remake that I discovered first. And then I followed that thread to the Schrader version, and I followed the Schrader version back to the original Val Lewton movie, which we're going to talk about in greater detail in just a minute. There it is.
All roads lead to David Bowie.
As
That's
it should
true.
be.
As it should.
They played this over the opening. They played an instrumental version that he more or less hums over for the opening titles. And
no, he sings in it as well.
Does he?
It's just a different version.
I just remember the dun, 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 dun. I don't remember any words from the opening.
Well, he cut two different versions. Maybe they're just not used the way that you.
But anyway, yeah, you hear that song. It bookends the movie, essentially. And it plays over the end credits of Schrader's version, which is a freeze frame on a snarling big cat. We're going to get back to Cat People in just a minute, but I do want to do some background on Val Lewton real quick. He was born Vladimir Ivanovich Leventon, May 7th, 1904, in Yalta, Imperial Russia, what is now the Ukraine. He was of Jewish descent. He was the son of moneylender Max Hofschneider, which is just a fantastic, powerful name. And Nina Leventon, who was a pharmacist's daughter. In 1909, the family emigrated to the United States without their father. Val's name became Val Lewton at that point, and he was raised in Port Chester, New York. He went on to study journalism at Columbia University, and he authored 18 works of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. In 1932, he wrote the best-selling pulp novel No Bed of Her Own, which was later heavily altered and used as the basis for the film No Man of Her Own, starring Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. He moved to Hollywood after that. He was hired by MGM to be a publicist and assistant to the producer David O. Selznick. And while he was there, he worked on a small handful of movies for Selznick.
I think he was actually a story editor. Worked in the story department.
Well, his first credit on screen was Revolutionary Sequences Arranged By on Selznick's 1935 version of A Tale of Two Cities. Byron, you mentioned...
He also did Julius Caesar.
Yes, you mentioned that to me. Do you know what specifically his role in the production of Julius Caesar was?
I think it was basically in the same makeup, the same type of stuff, because he was trying to figure it all out.
Sure.
It's kind of like when he started out.
Working his way up. He was also an uncredited writer on Gone with the Wind. Now, in 1942, he was made the head of the horror unit at RKO Pictures. Byron.
Would you like to know why he was made the head of the horror unit?
Byron, I want to know. You told me this story earlier, and this made me chuckle quite a bit.
I guess he had a friend that basically was in the industry as well, that was doing the rounds and telling people that he was telling people, being self-deprecating, that he was a horrible author.
Yes.
Someone like myself misunderstood and told Karie, oh, he's a horror author, and that's how he got the job. They said, oh, well, he does horror, we got to hire him like right now.
Yeah.
He said it was a complete mistake, but that it worked out for the best.
I would say it did. And he became head of their horror unit, and he would have a certain amount of freedom to make the movies he wanted to make, but there were a set of guidelines imposed upon him by his superiors at RKO, and there were 3 specific rules that he had to follow. 1, each film had to come in at a budget under $150,000. 2, each film that he produced could run no longer than 75 minutes. And 3, the titles of each of these movies would be given to him ahead of time by his superiors. So this working relationship began in spectacular fashion, I would say, with Cat People in 1942.
Okay, I'll kick it off by talking about Cat People. First off, also, RKO was in a transitionary phase because after Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, they were looking to clean house, and even their stationery at the time said showmanship over genius. So basically, they really wanted to emulate the Universal horror model, and that was really a major thing they were hoping to achieve. Cat People, that was Val Lewton's first film, and really his most famous. In the film, Irina is a young Serbian immigrant who falls in love with an average Joe in the city. They get married, but soon it becomes revealed she has a terrible secret, and that's that she is obsessed with the tales, the folklore of her old village, and feels that if her passions are aroused, she will turn into a panther and kill her husband.
Yes.
So, naturally, complications ensue, leading the husband to take her to a psychiatrist. Meanwhile, he realizes that he truly loves his coworker, another woman, and that's kind of where the film takes off. And I like the casting of Simone Simon in this film. She's so perfect because she has a petite mouth, these kind of full round cheeks, and these almond-shaped feline sort of eyes. I mean, it's just terrific casting on his part. And are you okay? Do you have something?
Yeah, I have something in my eye. Sorry, no, I didn't want to interrupt you. But
I'm not.
Something in my eye is driving me crazy, but keep going. I'm invested.
Were you
Okay.
were you familiar with how he went about getting Jacques Tourneur to direct Cat People?
I'm not, actually, but I would love to hear that.
No, I was more curious, but I think when he got involved with Jacques Tourneur, he was also an immigrant filmmaker, so to speak, wanting to get involved. And one of the key things, we were talking about this I was talking about this earlier with Lex, with Mark Robeson and some of these people that he got involved with for the horror unit. His whole thing was, I will give you the chance to do whatever you want to do within those guidelines that Lex mentioned. And Tourneur was like, oh, I really see something here, meaning the Cat People film, which I think is just a fantastic movie in every way. But I was just mentioning because I think that when Lex was talking about those limitations, and you were talking about the RKO specific part about that, I think that he was always kind of going against the grain. You made the comment about the stationery.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of ways, even though clearly they couldn't see it, Lewton and all those people, Robeson, Tourneur, they really, and Robert Wise, obviously, they played into that because they, not only did it serve their career, but they were very creative people working with practically no money to create these things that, to me, stand up today as good as anything.
I kind of have a theory that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times when filmmakers get too much money, it's kind of a liability. I think it hampers creativity. I think sometimes it really leads to some self-indulgent filmmaking.
I agree.
So I kind of think a strict budget is a good thing. One thing in watching, and in some cases rewatching a lot of these films, is you notice they don't look cheap at all.
No.
I mean, we've
not at
all
all.
seen horror movies where the door's falling off the hinges
Yep.
and the sets, basically ramshackle. But, I mean, these films look A-list. The cinematography, the score, the editing. I mean, all that stuff is first class. They don't look the least bit cheap, B, Poverty Row, etc. Cinematography in Cat People is just, it's beautiful. And one thing that I think makes this film so effective is how subtle and minimal it is. It's a story of light and shadow, and where the unknown is more terrifying than the known. So we don't see the cat, we don't see her turn into the cat, we don't see her commit some heinous act. And I think he used the trick that Fritz Lang used in M, Spielberg later used in Jaws. I mean, both of those movies, you don't need to see what happens. You know what happens.
Yes.
Your imagination is probably more powerful than what you could see on screen. And when it comes to horror, I don't like slasher movies or torture porn. It's so not at all my thing for many reasons. But also, it shows you everything. I don't need to see what happens. I know what happens. And I think that's one of the reasons this film works. It's also, I was noticing the structure is very similar to The Wolfman with Lon Chaney, which would be made shortly before Cat People. So I almost wonder how much that had a direct influence on, you know, what Lewton and his team were doing at the time. Also, it's just such an artful film. I mean, for a quote horror film, it's elegant.
Yes.
And it's artful. And I love the swimming pool scene when the woman's in the pool and you just hear the noise, or you see those shadows on the wall, or you hear the sound effects, and that alone creates the terror. And I think that's kind of the genius of Cat People.
One of the things that really struck me about the film when you were talking about the structure is the dreams. Especially the dream that she has with the knight and, of course, the cats and everything. To me, considering the fact that they made this for no money, they really, got all the bang for their buck, so to speak. But I really think that, like she said, the key to Cat People, just like you said with Jaws and other films, is they make an art of not showing things. And they create this dreamlike world, which is not just her dreamlike world of fear, but they're all kind of in this almost state of being unconscious. And in a lot of ways, the characters are awakened by all this cat stuff, so to speak, the horror, and I think that's fantastic.
I was actually watching, in the Val Lewton box set, there's a documentary about Lewton, and I was watching that in preparation for this. And one of the points they bring up in the documentary, and I think it's a very good point, is that prior to Cat People, most horror films are set in a fantastical fantasy kind of world.
Oh, sure.
Right, where you have all the conventional tropes of the smog, the castle, the supernatural, whatever. But what Val Lewton accomplishes is he brings the supernatural into the everyday world.
Yes.
And I think that was a major shift in the horror genre, and certainly something Lewton did incredibly well, and again, through many of these classic films that he made.
When you commented a minute or two ago about the style employed in this movie, and what's interesting, and it's something that Byron and I talked about when we did this watch-along commentary for Cat People that we did, that you can find on YouTube, we talked about how, although Lewton is first and foremost primarily considered to be a horror producer, a horror filmmaker, most of his movies do not have that much in common with what I would assume modern audiences would understand a horror movie to be. And I think that's part of his genius, and part of what certainly could not have been expected by the people who brought him in to run the unit. He was given these parameters, but and correct me if you know or you feel differently, the idea for RKO, I think, was to try on some level to replicate the success that Universal had the decade prior with their big monster movies. And what they got was so far removed from that as far as intention, let alone execution. One of the things that we talked about, and I was hoping you could maybe expound upon a bit, is that to me, yes, there are the creepy, disturbing elements of the story in Cat People, but stylistically it has a lot more in common, at least on the surface, with a noir.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to actually bring that up because, the use of light, the use of shadow, the psychological terror as opposed to the, other kinds of terror. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of modern audiences that are not familiar with these kind of movies, I think they would probably look at it more as a noir than a straight up horror film by the way we would define it today. But yeah, I think Lewton definitely had that sensibility. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there was far greater use of a creeping and building sense of dread than there is any boo scares, except in one notable sequence. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the famous Lewton bus that was birthed in this film as a technique.
Are we talking about the time that she's walking to the bus and she feels like the cat is coming up on her parallel, and that is so well directed, that sequence. It's so well done, and it's been kind of ripped off, I guess, if you will, or homaged by many, many people ever since. But it's so effective because sometimes you know if someone's following you, you have that sort of sense that something's coming up on you, and he captured that so perfectly in that film.
Absolutely, and it's when I was doing a little bit of research on Val Lewton in general, and I came across the term Lewton bus for the first time, the way I saw it defined most frequently is any time you interrupt the tension that you've built in a sequence with a boo moment. And if we're to take that definition and run with it, what you're looking at in the Lewton bus, if that's what we want to call that technique, you're looking at the grandfather of jump scares. And jump scares have been used and overused and done to death in so many lesser films since. But we see the genesis of that technique, or the first real popular use of that technique, here.
Absolutely. Getting back to what you were saying about the universal template, so to speak, for trying to make these movies.
Yes.
I thought one of the things that was really interesting, and we didn't really touch upon it on the other ride-along thing with the cat people,
ride-along thing, yes.
is I think that one of the key things that he also did with his unit, with those people, is he added supernatural. I was just looking at her box set, and the supernatural element is such a key to the films that he made with his unit that doesn't necessarily fall into horror per se. Cat People clearly is evidence of that with these kind of spooky ancestral history of the village and everything. But just taking a look at some of the other films that he did with that unit, supernatural is something he really expounded upon, which at that time, the horror, that was very far away from what Universal was doing.
Sure.
Because he knew he couldn't do a Frankenstein or a King Kong. He had none of those icons. So it's like, let's go in a different way.
Right.
But that said, eventually he did get to work with some of those icons, which we'll talk about later, the introduction of Lugosi and Karloff into the Lewton canon.
So on Cat People, are there any other specific points that you wanted to highlight?
Oh gosh,
Because you could do an entire episode just on this movie. But I wanted to know, before we dive in further into his filmography, is there anything specifically that you really wanted to bring up about Cat
Jacques
People?
Tourneur, I don't know if it's Tourneur or Tournier, but apparently he said that was his most favorite film later in his career.
Yeah, and it was, of the movies that Val Lewton would go on to produce for RKO, as far as I know, none of them surpassed the success of that first one.
Well, they marketed the heck out of it, too. I mean, they pushed this and pushed it really hard because this was kind of the first offering from his unit. So I think that probably played a role in the success as well. And really, I just lost my train of thought, sorry. But
That's okay.
It's a great movie, and it looks so beautiful. I mean, the DVD looks so good.
Absolutely.
It's really good quality, and the image looks really fantastic. So
I will say, as somebody who revisited this movie today, actually, I'm a fan of this era of filmmaking, as we all are already, but even taking that into consideration, it holds up remarkably well. I think the story they're telling is just as effective now as I believe it might have been then, even if we are maybe a little more desensitized as audience members to some of the techniques that he was using. Because, Byron, one of the things you and I talked about while we were watching the movie is context. Is that you need to have a certain amount of context in mind watching movies, especially when you start getting back to the 40s and the 30s. You have to understand that maybe we now, in 2015, have seen some of these techniques used and reused and aped over and over and over again, but you have to bear in mind that audiences at this time had never seen this before. And you were giving them something that they didn't even know they wanted yet. But they ate it up.
Are you talking about the suspension of belief? Is that what you're talking about in regard to what we were talking about earlier, or are you talking about something else?
As far as suspension of belief, as far as
Well, you have to kind of jump in head first to buy the fact that these things are happening within the film. Her transforming
about context. You mean
right? The paw prints and things like that we talked about. You said that you were having some problems, but that's the leap we have to take.
Yes, I agree with that completely.
I mean, it's a fantasy film.
Yes, when I brought up context, I meant more specifically that you have to remember in the year that this was made, there was nothing else like this. There have been things like this to varying extents, even if you discount the movie that is a direct remake of this one. There have been similar stories told since then. But at this time in cinema, this had never existed. So you have to, as a modern viewer, do your best to watch it in a vacuum, I would say, would be the best advice that I could give. But even disregarding that, point being, I think it holds up remarkably, remarkably well. And audiences of the day really seemed to gravitate towards it. And it became very successful. And it became successful enough that Lewton was afforded a little bit more freedom, provided he could stay within the parameters set for him by his superiors. And after Cat People, he would work with I agree with you. I'm not quite sure on the specific pronunciation of Tournier.
It's Tourneur, but I'm not 100%.
But they worked together twice more immediately. And they worked together on I Walked with a Zombie, which is essentially Jane Eyre, but
correct,
with voodoo, which is great, by the way. That's $1 million pitch, Jane Eyre with voodoo. So they did that one. They did The Leopard Man, which featured the same big cat they used in Cat People. And after that, Tournier was promoted by RKO to make A Pictures. So suddenly, Val Lewton doesn't have his point man anymore.
And that's when he had the opportunity to do Out of the Past.
Yes, when he turned Tournier.
When our boy Jacques.
When Jacques really put noir on the map, so to speak.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, I just remembered the point I wanted to make when I forgot what I was going to say a
minute
ago. Is that Lewton, in many ways, is a producer as auteur. And that's something you don't see a lot in film because, as we know, film is really a director's medium.
Yes.
And a lot of times when people talk about these films, they talk about Val Lewton. So that's kind of a rare thing. There aren't a ton of producers that you can say that about, that they have an imprint of their own on every one of their films.
Absolutely. And I actually we'll touch on that a little bit more specifically in a few minutes. Once our boy Jacques had moved on, suddenly Val Lewton is in need of a point man, and he finds point men in the form of Robert Wise and Mark Robson. And when we get to the end of our episode, we can touch on the things that they went on to themselves in a little bit more detail. But Seventh Victim, which was Kim Hunter's first film, was Mark Robson's first movie under Lewton. He also immediately did The Ghost Ship, which came out the same year. And in 1944, because of how popular Cat People had been, there was released a sequel called The Curse of the Cat People.
That's correct. This is a film that is really a sequel in name only.
Yes.
It really touched upon some of the ideas that Lewton wanted to really utilize in Cat People that didn't have the opportunity, the dreams and the psychological. He kind of used briefly in the film referencing the Unseen Playmate, because this is a story really about a little girl. It's kind of like a little girl lost story.
Yes.
It's just that it's brought into the characters of Cat People. The Serbian woman that speaks to her in Cat People, she reappears in Curse of the Cat People. It's almost like a haunted house movie with a little girl. It's not anything at all like Cat People.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, those freedoms that were given him, he took advantage. He didn't make anything like Cat People. And we were talking about this earlier. Curse of the Cat People is a film that would be more probably at home in a psychology class.
Absolutely.
It's analytical. It's got Jung in it. It's got all these ideas about psychoanalysis. It's dealing with one of the ideas he was trying to touch on in Cat People, but he full force does it in Curse of the Cat People. Every character has all these problems that they cannot overcome, that they can't deal with and they can't grapple. They don't believe the little girl. They don't believe what's even going on in their own lives. They're suppressing all their problems. It's very psychological, and yet, am I saying it right? Is it Simone Simon?
Simone.
She returns as a ghost figure in the film to basically guide the young girl, and it's unlike any film I had ever seen. Not that it's any better than Cat People, it's just very different. And in a lot of ways, I think the dream aspect that he really was kind of beginning to tap in Cat People, he went full force with Curse of the Cappy, which I thought was really interesting, considering the fact that it was still a very successful film. It deals with a lot of the things that are, I guess, the society was dealing with at the time, suppressed emotion and such as that. It was just clearly, like I said, a sequel in name only. It seemed to be the beginning of the whole idea of capitalizing on sequels to other movies. The only thing, like I said, and you and I were talking about this earlier, it's just nothing like Cat People at all.
The title doesn't fit the film whatsoever.
The returning cast is great, but clearly they're telling a different story.
When there's no cat people in this story
There's no cat of any kind, yeah.
That's in a sense why it is the curse.
Sure. It really was more a marketing decision than a creative one to tie it into the earlier movie at all.
And the curse itself is what her widowed husband has to deal with, because even though he loves his little girl and clearly loves his wife, he can't seem to get past the indelible impression that she had on him.
Yes.
Hence, when she returns as the ghost, there's even a moment towards the end of the film where he doesn't believe her, his daughter, who sees the ghost on more than one occasion.
I think he would have learned.
I think to the point where he actually spanks her, so to speak. But later at the end, when things come around and he realizes, and his wife kind of helps him, the catharsis of this whole process, he's with her and he asks her if she sees her, and she says absolutely. He doesn't even look over, and he basically tells her, I see her too. He's now going to be a good father. It's almost as if, like in the Val Lewton films, all the problems are going to be solved eventually.
Sure.
It may not work out perfect, but they'll be solved.
Sure. You mentioned, and I think this would be as good a time as any to bring up a thematic motif that recurs pretty frequently in the movies that Lewton produced for RKO, which is this idea of a legacy of, if not evil, then certainly fear.
Absolutely.
Of fears tied to, we talked about on the commentary we did, tied to specifically the ancestral.
Absolutely.
If not literally the ancestral, then a legacy of some kind. Whether it's Irena's fear of transforming into a cat person because of the people that she comes from.
That she could hurt.
Right.
And the bird, of course, clearly.
Right, and that fear stemming from the history of her lineage, of the people that she comes from. Or in Curse of the Cat People, you just mentioned Oliver's fear or Oliver's reaction to the situation around him stemming from the impact that was left on him previously by Irena. And that's something that we'll see, this fear of the ancestral or fear stemming from a legacy left by someone repeats itself fairly frequently in the movies that he produced for RKO.
Absolutely.
So the other thing I do think is fascinating about Curse of the Cat People is that it is far more than a horror film, like you said. It is a psychology study. It's got a very odd, almost Disney fairy tale aspect to it.
Well, the fantasy aspect of it, I was thinking, and I know since we all have seen the film recently, there's a whole sequence that in regarding to her birthday party.
Yes.
Now, I don't know about you, and certainly don't know about you, but birthday parties are a pretty big deal. And she doesn't get a birthday party because she bought into something her father told her that was fantastical. Just believing her dad outright, she put the letters in a tree because the dad said it was a magic tree, so clearly it's going to deliver the mail.
Sure.
This is a kind of a watershed moment in the film because he's constantly fighting the fact that she's living this fantasy life or this fantasy idea, but yet he's the one, in a sense, presenting it for her.
Sure.
He has no one really to blame but himself. And she finds, like I said, the thing that's mentioned in the film, the Unseen Playmate, she finds that friend in Simon's character when she reappears as the ghost because she wants to protect her and help her. It's a very like you said, it's definitely not anything like Cappy. It's not even really a horror film in that sense. It's kind of like a ghost story, like you said, Disney-esque very much.
Yeah, the little girl's really good.
She's fantastic.
I could totally see her as like a little Alice in Wonderland or sort of like in a Disney film. And feels somewhere. It's almost like she's walked out of a Disney film and into another film on accident, and then she.
Yes, I could see that absolutely. Are there any specific points that you want to make still about Curse of the Cat People?
Just one.
Just one.
and I think you could make the same point with Cat People. Technology has always been such a huge component of filmmaking in Hollywood, especially pushing things forward. I don't care if you're talking about something like you had mentioned earlier, Jaws, or even perhaps Lex's favorite, Star Wars. Technology constantly pushes these things forward.
Sure.
I think with their limitations, they relied so heavily, not just on the visual design, but I think one of the things that's really overlooked, and we were speaking about it earlier, audio is such a component in Cat People, and of course, Curse of the Cat People. It's almost as if it's just as important as the camera, because he's telling the story just as much. With you made the comment about the sequence in the pool with the audio. It's such a, and then you made the big thing about the Lewton bus. It's like audio is nobody ever really thinks about that.
Sure.
And Lewton, by no fault of his own, clearly being practical, he's the way that people are now sound designers and things like that. That's what he's doing, even though clearly he's just doing it to tell a better story. But at the time, that was not something that was utilized in the way that he did it.
Absolutely.
It's really, we take it on faith because we so used to everything. But at the time, like you made the comment, it was totally new. And I think in all his films, not just the 2 or the 3 that we're highlighting today, especially when she was talking about Cat People, it's all over it. Because it's helping tell the story. It's great. It's a tool.
Yeah, it is a tool. And that's exactly what I wanted to say, is that a lot of modern filmmakers, we now have so much technology at our disposal, and it's so, provided you have the budget, it's so easy to lean on some of these tools, almost to the extent that your story starts to serve all of these pieces rather than using these pieces to serve the story.
Right.
Karie,
she said the same thing about the money. If too much money, you're not really going to get a better movie. You're just going to get an expensive movie.
Exactly. And there is that train of thought where it's your limitations that will force you to be more creative. And I think rather than being able to use any of the tools as a crutch, they had to take advantage of every tool that was at their disposal and really get as much use out of every element they had as possible. And I think you see every bit of that on the screen in all of these movies that we're talking about.
I think that's why he's so prolific. Even she said it earlier. It's like and I mean, I know we talked about this earlier before, I think the last show. There's very few producers that anybody ever talks about as being creative, and he's clearly the key. He's the key mark. I mean, Selznick and they talk about a lot of people, and they're
big names.
Spielberg and Selznick.
Joe Silver and all these different producers, but Lewton was such a hands-on guy, and that's so unheard of today.
Yes.
Just because that doesn't really seem to be cost-effective. And then it wasn't about that. It was about something else.
Yes, absolutely. So after Curse of the Cat People, he made Mademoiselle Fifi with Robert Wise, made Youth Runs Wild with Mark Robson, and then made The Body Snatcher. In 1945, Robert Wise directed it. Now, this movie was based on the short story of the same name by Robert Louis Stevenson, who most people probably know because he wrote Treasure Island, for example.
I would think.
Treasure Island, I think, is a title that...
Swiss Family Robinson, I think, too.
Was that one of his? There's another one that any literary buffs are going to scream that there's one big one that is not coming to me immediately, and I'm going to get comments about it later. I'm going to go, darn, I should have brought it.
But it's interesting also that they chose a short story as well.
Sure. Well, and it's also, there was some debate about whether or not it was in the public domain at the time, which means they wouldn't have had to pay for the rights, which I'm sure
was a big part of that.
Very appealing to them. The short story was first published in the Pall Mall Christmas Extra in December 1884, and it's based pretty directly on the infamous crimes of Burke and Hare. Now, for those of you listening out there in internet land, maybe don't know who Burke and Hare are. They committed murders and sold the bodies to a medical college and made money doing that. Because at the time, dissection of corpses was not permitted by law. And there was Dr. Robert Knox, who was, of note, a medical instructor, had to find a way to get his materials off the radar, as it were. Burke and Hare discovered they could make money doing this, and so they did. And it's become a very infamous story. You've seen elements of this story used reused over and over again in different works of fiction.
Well, there's at least 6 film versions, at least.
Pretty recently, actually, 2011, John Landis did one, Burke and Hare, starring Simon
With
Pegg, and Andy Serkis.
which is, it's a fantastic because it's very faithful.
Yeah, it actually is. It hews pretty closely to the actual story.
Even with the comedic elements, the actual details are right on.
Yes, and it actually their series of crimes gave birth to a term that was used for a while. It's a pretty archaic term, but the term burking, which is to kill someone by smothering them. A little bit later, it passed into more general usage as any word for suppression or cover-up. Now, it's not used very often. I bring it up only because it's a term used in The Body Snatcher several times.
Absolutely.
Most notably in the final scene between Karloff and Lugosi. Speaking of which, this was, Karie, you mentioned earlier, this was a reteaming of horror icons Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi.
Their final one, actually.
It was their final. They had made a series of films together. They made Black Cat,
which is fantastic.
They made The Raven. They made Invisible Ray, Son of Frankenstein, Black Friday. This was their final on-screen pairing.
The Swan Song?
The Swan Song, if you will. Now, Karloff actually credits Lewton and this project with saving him from what he felt at that point was the drastically overextended Frankenstein franchise at Universal. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I have seen every entry in Boris Karloff's filmography, but this has to be up there with the greatest performances of his that are on camera that we have.
Oh, absolutely.
He is this cab driver named Gray. He's a cab driver by day, and by cab, it's,
carriage.
It's a carriage. It's a horse and carriage. It's a story, by the way, set in Scotland in the mid 1800s. Early, it's like 1831. So cab means horse-drawn carriage. That's his day job. At night, he steals corpses. Much in the same way that Burke and Hare would sell them to a medical college, he will procure these corpses and deliver them to a doctor friend of his. And it ties back into, thematically, what we were talking about earlier about the ancestral. The way the story goes, Gray, Karloff's character, was acquainted with Burke and Hare at the time of the original trial. And his the Henry Daniel character that they called Toddy, Dr. McFarlane, was the pupil of Dr. Knox. No? Correct. So the entire movie, Karloff has this history that he can hang over that character, and he does to pretty intimidating effect over the course of the story.
Sure.
Dr. McFarlane wants nothing to do, really past a point, with Gray, with the things that he does, but he can't extricate himself from this relationship because of what Gray has on him. And then you've also got Lugosi, and Lugosi in this movie, it's not a huge role.
He doesn't have a lot to do.
It's very understated.
He plays Joseph, and Joseph is what would you call Joseph? What is his job? What would you say his profession is? He's just the house guy, basically.
He's kind of a household staffer, basically, who does whatever's necessary around the house.
Kind of like a bellhop.
He's a little bit like a bellhop.
He's kind of like a valet almost. He's there to do these things, but nobody really wants to do those things at all. And he's there, but yet not really significantly, like you said.
And
it's background.
Right, and because of what his role is on the grounds where he toils, nobody's paying too much attention to him. And that's why later in the story, he's able to overhear some of these conversations. He's able to find out what's going on about Gray and the procurement of these bodies and how these bodies are being used. And he attempts to use this information to blackmail Karloff's character in the scene, the ultimate final scene between the two of them that I mentioned. And it does not go particularly well for poor Joseph. He's a victim of a burking. As it were. You mentioned, both of you talked a little bit about Val Lewton, the producer, as auteur and how uncommon that was. And it's interesting, too, that he would do the final drafts of the screenplays for all of the movies he produced, but he avoided taking a writing credit.
Correct.
There are only 2 examples of him taking a writing credit on these movies, and one is Body Snatcher and the other is Bedlam, but in both cases he didn't use his name. He didn't credit himself as Val Lewton. He used a pseudonym, Carlos Keith, which is interesting. He'll take credit, but even when he's taking the credit, he won't take the credit, which I find very interesting. And I find
I think Thalberg was also another producer as auteur, and he always said credit if you... I'm going to butcher the phrase, but his point was if you have to give yourself credit, then... Oh, God, what was the phrase? Credit worth putting on the screen is not credit worth having, or something to that effect. But basically, Thalberg didn't put his name on films.
But I can see why this is important to you, Lex. That I can understand.
Wow, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, it's important because, like you said, he's putting his name out there, but it's not even his name. He's
the Coen brothers do that, too.
True. But I just think it's interesting that because these are all, yes, you've got the talents of other directors that will themselves go on to great things, but he really is. He is the driving creative figure at the top. I think he knew that. I think it was enough for him, and so it's interesting to see that even when he takes credit, he still resists taking credit by name. So do either one of you have any specific thoughts about Body Snatcher, anything that we haven't covered that you think needs to be mentioned?
I like this movie because it kind of proves that Karloff can be terrifying, and he doesn't need mummy bandages. He doesn't need Frankenstein makeup.
Absolutely.
He doesn't need all the trappings of a lot of his previous films, and he's so effective in that movie. His character is relentless. He won't go away because he refuses, and it's that simple. And I think he's just fantastic. And this is kind of really, you're right, and then I think that kind of marked a turning point in his career. And Lewton, they got along really well, apparently, and I think Karloff had some great roles under Val Lewton and really flourished under his guidance.
Watching him toy with people in the movie is so wonderful. I mean, the way he clearly, as an actor, you see him relishing in being able to deliver the performance he's delivering, and it makes those scenes doubly enjoyable because you've got the enjoyment you're seeing from the character Gray as he toys with these people, and you can see how much Gray is enjoying it, but you can see just under that how clearly Karloff is enjoying and relishing in every moment that he gets in this movie.
He makes such an impression that even when his character, shall we say, goes away,
yes,
you still think, not really.
Right.
Not really, because he makes such an impression that his presence kind of lingers over the film, even in scenes that he's not in.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
You could almost imagine an alternate universe where they made a direct sequel to The Body Snatcher in name only, which would turn out to be another child psychology piece where the ghost of Boris Karloff would visit a little girl.
Well, I truly think, to up what Carrie's saying, that Karloff is an underrated actor.
I would
in every
say
way.
so.
And we had just watched, we just talked about the Hawks, his appearance in
Even
Scarface,
Yeah.
which he's fantastic in that, and his last film, the Peter Bogdanovich film,
Targets.
He's pretty much the lead, or one of the leads, so to speak. And as an older man, clearly, like you said, this was a big deal with Lewton to kind of change that idea of the Frankenstein. I totally agree 100% with Carrie. Not only is he fantastic in the film, but Karloff was always an actor first.
Yep.
And I think that's missed a lot by the Frankenstein thing.
I think the horror genre, Hollywood has always become notorious for stereotyping or typecasting people.
Yep.
Think about Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Peter Lorre, Vincent Price.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of those guys were such fine actors, and they couldn't get out of the horror film rut. That's how people saw them eternally. And that had to have been really creatively frustrating to try to, when you want to do other things, you know?
mean, like Vincent Price and Laura.
Yeah, he's
It's
so good.
It's just a perfect example because, like, you made I think you made the comment, or maybe it was Carrie, about the fact that here he is doing all this stuff and he doesn't have a stitch of makeup on.
Sure.
That, to me, is, like you said, that's breaking down that idea that we have. Because you're right, everything's so typecast. People just, they see the name, like Lugosi or whatever, they just kind of, it's a one-note thing. And it's great that he was kind of released from all that because of these Lewton pictures.
Yep.
Because he went on to do so many other things.
Yeah, and I mean, right after Body Snatcher, like Carrie, like you mentioned, he continued his working relationship with Val Lewton. They made Isle of the Dead and Bedlam, both of which were directed by Mark Robson. And what I think is really fascinating because this actually, Bedlam brings us to the end of Val Lewton's run as head of the horror unit at RKO. And I think before we go any further, I just want to point out the fact that This massively influential, historic run of movies was 4 years long.
Right.
That was the entirety of his run. It was a handful of movies in 4 years. And to me, that's astounding. That in 4 years, he accomplished what many filmmakers, whether they're writers, directors, producers, only dream of accomplishing in an entire lifetime. Which, I mean, that's, to me, incredible.
Absolutely.
What happened in 1946 is that RKO head Charles Kerner passed away. And there were a series of personnel shifts. There's a big regime change at the studio. And around the same time, Val Lewton suffered his first heart attack. It was mild, but it left him in a weakened state. And unfortunately, simultaneously, the personnel changes at RKO also left him unemployed. So through connections, he rewrote this unused screenplay, which was based on the life of Lucretia Borgia, and it got him employed at Paramount. And while he was at Paramount, he produced the movie My Own True Love, which I believe was the Deborah Kerr movie, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds right.
I believe that's the Deborah Kerr movie. After that, he bounced around a little bit. He didn't stay with one studio for more than one picture in this period. After that, he went to MGM, where he produced Please Believe Me in 1950, and then he produced Apache Drums for Universal. And of the movies that he was involved with post-RKO, Apache Drums is the one that is talked about as being the most in line with his RKO movies. Now, after this, Stanley Kramer, producer at the time, he offers Lewton a job as an assistant producing a series of films for Columbia Pictures. So Lewton resigns from Universal and he begins prepping to go to work on these movies. And at that time, he suffered some gallstone problems and then had 2 heart attacks, more or less back to back, and his state was so deteriorated that unfortunately he did not recover from those heart attacks, and he passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center on March 14th, 1951, at the age of 46. And it's fascinating that he died so young, and yet his work has influenced so much of what came after. I mean, it is staggering to take into account the effect that his work with RKO Pictures had on cinema as a whole going forward. So really right now, what I want to talk to you guys about is the legacy of Val Lewton and his work. So anywhere that you guys want to jump in, because there's so much that can be said about the impact that he has had and continues to have.
Well, I'm going to mention again, since we're talking about Jacques Tournier.
Yes.
He was often quoted as saying that in terms of RKO, and especially working there with Val Lewton, that he was considered the dreamer.
Yes.
And I think that's very interesting to think of when basically we don't think about movies as anything but fantasy and dreams, that everything you said about them trying to redo the Universal stuff and how they basically tried to set limitations for him, that wasn't necessarily a good thing for him as a dreamer.
Sure.
But by getting in bed, so to speak, with Jacques Tournier and Robeson and, of course, Wise, he was able to fulfill those ideas through these people. Now, I don't think it can be taken lightly when you were talking about Cat People, the noir influence, because clearly that's the stylings of Jacques Tournier, but without the support of somebody like Val Lewton, it wouldn't happen in the way that it did. And of course, I was just doing that where we watched it just moments ago. It's so clearly a noir, but not a noir the way people expect.
Sure.
Turning it on its head, so to speak. And I think that's one of the reasons you made the comment. His legacy is incredibly strong. You mentioned some of his later films, and I'm not saying anything negative about those. I think the key RKO stuff, I think that's the influence, so to speak, the legacy.
Well, and it's fascinating the way you just put that. I agree with you completely, that not to knock his later films in the slightest, because The Body Snatcher was one of his latter movies, and it's one of my favorites of his.
Great film.
But everything that his work would be known for and revered for was all there in the first one that he did.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned again our friend Jacques. I do, before even talking about Lewton himself in terms of legacy, real quick, I mean, let's just look at the work done by the guys he picked as his point men. I mean, you mentioned Out of the Past. Are there any other titles off the top of your head that you want to rattle off that are his?
Of Jacques Tournier?
Yes.
That's the most significant.
Sure.
But the reason why I even brought up that one is just because since he did Cat People, it's such it is, most people in noir consider that like the epitome of noir, Out of the Past. It's such a perfect idea of what noir is.
Sure.
They even remade it years later as Against All Odds with Jeff Bridges and Rachel Ward.
That's right.
But it's I'm not giving, and I'm sorry if I said it the wrong way, I'm not trying to give Jacques Tourneur the credit for that on Cat People. I'm saying working with Lewton, that's what he was able to create.
Absolutely.
I think that was the key.
Well, that birthed his career.
And there's 2 directors, I didn't get a chance to say, but there's 2 directors on Curse of the Cat People.
Yes.
One of them being Wise, and I think that that's one of the reasons why they balanced out this very unique movie. Not that all of his movies aren't unique, but there's something about that one, that dreamlike quality. You were talking clearly about, obviously, Bedlam and Isle of the Dead and all these other films that he did later, but when she was talking about Cat People, you're right, it's almost like out of the gate he was already making as good as you could give, and he still kept giving.
Yes.
Quite a bit.
Yes, and I do want to touch on what both Robson and Wise went on to do following their work with Val Lewton. Now, yes, Val Lewton gave them their first opportunities, their first breaks in the business, but these guys, after working with Lewton at RKO, were certainly no slouches themselves.
Well, Wise edited Citizen Kane.
What he did, he edited Citizen Kane.
And then he butchered Emerson's.
He was involved in the butchering.
It
balances out.
It kind of balances out.
It cancels all. It just didn't even happen. But Robson, after working with Val Lewton at RKO, would go on to make Peyton Place, Von Ryan's Express, Valley of the Dolls. Robert Wise would go on to a pretty astounding career. If you look at his IMDb page, you're going to see titles like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Papillon, co-director on West Side Story. You're going to see The Haunting, which would be remade years and years later with Liam Neeson's in it, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Owen Wilson gets his head knocked off by a flying lion statue.
Sound of Music?
He directed The Sound of Music. Yes, he did. Directed The Sand Pebbles, directed The Andromeda Strain, directed Star Trek, the motion picture.
Well, now, wait a minute. We don't... What? The 1979 Star Trek film?
Star Trek.
Is it still available?
It is. I've seen it with my eyes.
Did you like that, Lex?
It's long. But
fair enough.
But his career is certainly nothing to balk at, and it happened in part because of the opportunities he was initially given by Lewton.
He went directly, I think, from Lewton. One of the things that he did that I loved, one of his earlier films, I don't know if you saw it, Carry the Setup.
I have not seen that one.
I think Robert Ryan's in it, but I mean, I'm just...
Wait, maybe I have. I'm sorry.
Like you're all talking about all these, these early films that these people made, because you're right, he was a great pedigree for these people. It's like they just turned out great stuff. That's all they did.
Absolutely. And not to labor the point, but Lewton's influence, the influence of the styles he pioneered and the techniques he employed cannot be underestimated. I mean, yes, there are specific examples like Schrader's Cat People of direct remakes of his movies, but there are, you can see pieces of what he did all over. I mean, the one that's coming to mind immediately, Scorsese's Shutter Island has, in my opinion, has elements of Lewton all over it. And you know Scorsese's a fan because relatively recently he produced that documentary, the Man in the Shadows documentary.
That's correct.
Yeah. I would also say The Innocents with Deborah
absolutely.
Kerr.
Absolutely.
That is very, very much, it has to have been influenced by Val Lewton's work.
And I will say the other two, the very first time I became aware of Val Lewton, before I saw Cat People, before I'd heard of Cat People, before I'd heard the David Bowie song, was in Final Destination, which is far more of the ilk of maybe some of the movies that carry the types of movies that are not
too far
your
from
taste.
Torture porn, actually.
Pretty close.
But
there is a tip of the hat to Lewton in that movie. Their teacher, who, like most of the characters in that motion picture, meets a grisly demise in one manner or another, is named Valerie Lewton. And I didn't know at the time that this was a reference, and I maybe, after I saw it, was reading some IMDb something about it, saw reference to this producer. And at that point, it took the David Bowie song to bring me all the way back around to the producer Val Lewton. But I thought that was a nice tip of the hat, even though the style of that movie could almost not be further from what Lewton did.
Well, they are making it cheaply, though.
To be fair,
they're being pragmatic in the same sense. You're right; it's not even on the same level, but the production idea is very similar.
Sure,
you can't say that.
Yes, but it's nice to see that. It's not maybe the most subtle tip of the hat, but it was nice to see. Are there any other examples that leap out at you immediately that you can think of just off the top of your head?
Maybe The Exorcist?
Yeah. Absolutely. Because here's the thing that I was talking about, audio. Exorcist is all audio.
True. Very true.
And I don't think you were saying about his legacy and his influence. Exorcist, was one of the most successful films ever made.
Yep.
And if you watch it today, no matter how old you are, that comes across much like his supernatural ideas. I mean, that it's all in that film, and audio is such a key point. I feel like his, just kind of like we were talking about last week, the influence is unending. I could she said Exorcist, I could say 100 films. She said even Jaws. I mean, it's like they're all inspired by what he did because he kind of made it up.
Absolutely. Yeah, it did not exist in film before Lewton did what Lewton did.
And if it did, it certainly was not as powerful as the way that he did it.
Absolutely. So, guys, before we wrap up, any other thoughts, any lingering, dangling pieces of Lewton ephemera that we haven't touched that you want to get to?
Ephemera?
Ephemera.
I'd just say what I always say, which is watch the movies.
Yes. Absolutely.
I mean, we live in a day where so much of the stuff, again, right at your fingertips. It is not hard to get access to this stuff. So
no, I believe all of the movies we jumped into specifically are on iTunes. You can rent them for, I believe they're under $7.
And this lovely DVD box set includes nine movies.
Yeah,
so,
the box set that Karie brought in is basically everything we talked about and more. That is his most influential work. Not to belittle any of his later stuff.
Oh, sure.
But that to me is the key stuff. And to me, that's all you really need. Well, it's all there.
The box set covers the majority, if not the entirety, of his run at RKO. No.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so that's pick up the box set. If you find it online, it can't be that expensive. If not, check these movies out. They're accessible. They are out there.
Well, I'm sure it's the same thing. I'm sure just like the Star Wars stuff and everything. I'm sure it's available on iTunes. You just get to select it.
Yeah, absolutely.
She just happens to have the box set, which is great.
It's a really nice box set, by the way. You can see little pieces of it. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see some of these cases we have set up on the table here with this wonderful poster art. So that is Val Lewton.
That's Val Lewton.
That is Val Lewton, Val Lewton's legacy. Thank you guys very much for joining us for this conversation. You can continue to watch us on YouTube, youtube.com/Popcorn Talk Network. Follow the network at Popcorn Talk. Yes?
Sure.
Yes? You agree? You think that's a good idea?
The Popcorn Talk.
My mistake. At the Popcorn Talk. There is a the. I should remember this because my Twitter handle has a the in it as well. That Twitter handle, by the way, is at the Lex Michael. I'm also on Instagram at the Lex Michael.
I'm Byron Thompson. I'm at Byron Lee on Twitter.
Hi, I'm Karie Bible at Film Radar.
All right, so subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on iTunes, like us, rate us 5 stars. Yes.
Are you going to tease the next week's show?
Would you like to tease next week's show?
I would like somebody to tease it. Why don't you tease it?
But next week, if I'm not mistaken, we are going to dive into the life, work, and legend of Marilyn Monroe.
The unseen Marilyn.
The
Absolutely.
unseen Marilyn. So join us again next time on Historic Hollywood. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.